In the corner of a smoky casino floor, a young woman in a sleek dress sat calmly at a blackjack table, flipping chips forward with practiced ease. A few feet behind her, a man in a wheelchair rolled past, slowing just long enough to meet her eyes. They exchanged the faintest nod. To everyone else in the room, it meant nothing. To them, it meant everything. Across the table, the dealer hesitated. He'd dealt to high rollers before. He'd seen tourists get lucky. But something about this table felt wrong. The bets were small, then suddenly enormous, placed at moments that felt too precise to be random. And the man in the wheelchair, he was sure he'd seen him before. Standing. Within minutes, thousands of dollars were stacked on the felt. Hands were won. Chips disappeared into neat piles. And just as quickly as the action began, it stopped. The players drifted away, blending back into the casino crowd as if nothing unusual had happened. What no one watching could see was that this wasn't gambling. It was a system. These weren't reckless high rollers chasing a rush. They weren't cheaters using hidden devices or marked cards. They were college students, quiet, methodical, and mathematically precise, executing a plan they had practiced hundreds of times before. Every movement had been rehearsed. Every signal memorized. Every risk calculated. They knew the rules better than the casino itself. And they knew the danger. One wrong signal. One suspicious glance. One misstep by anyone at the table, and they wouldn't just be asked to leave. They'd be blacklisted. Not from one casino, but from all of them. In Vegas, reputations travel fast. Once you're marked, every pit boss knows your face. That's why they moved quickly. A single weekend was all they needed. 48 hours. Sometimes less. In that time, they could walk away with hundreds of thousands of dollars in profit. And before anyone could piece together what had happened, these same players would be on a red-eye flight back east, trading casino lights for classroom desks, back in Cambridge in time for Monday morning lectures. To the casinos, it looked like isolated luck. A few big wins. Nothing more. But this wasn't an accident. It wasn't a fluke. It was the opening move in one of the most successful and disciplined card-counting operations the gambling world had ever seen. Built not in back rooms or smoke-filled bars, but inside one of the most prestigious universities in the world. Because while the house is designed to always win, these students had found something the casinos never expected. An invisible edge. And this was only the beginning. The story didn't begin under neon lights or surveillance cameras. It began in a classroom. At the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a small group of students enrolled in an unusual course titled How to Gamble If You Must. Despite the name, the class wasn't about chasing wins or beating casinos. Its purpose was almost the opposite, to demystify gambling using statistics and probability. The professor made the lesson clear from day one. Gambling, he explained, is a losing proposition. Not emotionally, mathematically. Across almost every casino game, the odds are stacked against the player. On average, only 80 to 95% of the money wagered ever makes its way back to players. For every dollar you put in, you're getting 80 cents back. Sometimes less. The house always wins. That wasn't opinion. It was math. But then, the professor added a caveat. There was one game where the math might bend, Blackjack. In theory, under very specific conditions, a player could gain a small but real advantage over the casino. Not through luck. Not through cheating. But through strategy, discipline, and perfect execution. Most students treated it as an academic curiosity. An interesting edge case. Something that worked on paper but collapsed in the real world. One student didn't. J.P. Masser listened carefully, and didn't buy it. The idea sounded too clean. Too convenient. Casinos had built empires on this game. Entire cities ran on blackjack tables. If it were truly beatable, someone would have exposed it long ago. JP wasn't interested in theory. He wanted proof. If the house really could be beaten, it wouldn't be through stories or anecdotes. It would show up in numbers. Cold, repeatable, undeniable results. And if the professor was wrong, JP intended to prove that too. What began as a class discussion quietly turned into a challenge, not against a casino, but against one of the most deeply held beliefs in gambling, that no matter how smart you are, the system always wins. JP was about to test whether that belief was actually true. JP wasn't willing to take anyone's word for it, not even a professor at MIT. If Blackjack really could be beaten, the evidence would have to come from math, not confidence. So JP did what he knew best. He went looking for a machine that could settle the argument. At the time, one of the most powerful computers available sat at MIT's Lincoln Laboratory in Lexington, a massive mainframe used for advanced research. JP, then a graduate student in computer science, gained access and began writing a program from scratch. The goal was simple in theory, but brutal in execution. Model Blackjack. Model player behavior. Then play the game over and over again. JP wrote code to simulate hundreds of thousands of blackjack hands, running what's known as a Monte Carlo experiment. Instead of guessing outcomes, the program let probability play itself out across massive sample sizes. Every hand followed strict strategy. Every decision was logged. No emotion. No fatigue. No luck. Just math. What JP was testing wasn't whether a single player could win. Casinos expect that. What he wanted to know was whether a coordinated group of players, working together and sharing information, could systematically tip the odds. And eventually, the results came in. They were unmistakable. If enough hands were played, and if players were disciplined enough to act only when the conditions were right, the edge flipped. Slowly, but decisively. Over time, the player didn't just break even. The player won. Not occasionally. Not by chance. But statistically. With the right strategy, and with players signaling information to one another, the house advantage disappeared. In its place was something casinos never planned for, a small but persistent edge in favor of the player. JP had his proof. But he also knew its limits. A simulation didn't deal with distractions. It didn't account for casino noise, human error, surveillance, or pressure. It didn't have pit bosses watching every move or security cameras tracking patterns. The model worked on a computer. Whether it would work in the real world was an entirely different question. There was only one way to find out. They would have to walk into a casino and put real money on the line. JP knew the theory was sound. But theory doesn't blink under casino lights. To see if the model could survive the real world, JP gathered a small, loosely connected group of fellow MIT students. They weren't professionals. They weren't organized. But they were confident, maybe too confident, in what the math had shown them. They packed their bags and headed to Atlantic City, the gambling capital of the East Coast. In their minds, the outcome felt inevitable. The system worked on a computer. They understood the math. How hard could it be to replicate it at a blackjack table? Reality answered quickly. Without clear roles, without strict discipline, and without experience handling pressure, the group unraveled. Bets were mistimed. Counts were lost. Communication broke down. The casino environment, loud, crowded, chaotic, did what no simulation could. It overwhelmed them. By the end of the trip, the result was unmistakable. They had lost almost everything they walked in with. For most of the students, that was the end of the story. They finished their degrees. They graduated. They moved on with their lives, filing blackjack away as an interesting experiment that didn't quite work outside the lab. But for JP, the failure didn't disprove the theory. It exposed the real problem. The math wasn't wrong. The execution was. What the computer model had assumed, perfect coordination, flawless timing, absolute discipline, simply didn't exist in their group. Not yet. JP returned to Cambridge convinced of one thing. If Blackjack was going to be beaten, it wouldn't be by a casual group of students trying their luck on the weekend. It would require structure, training, and people who were willing to treat it like work. The first attempt had collapsed, but the idea itself was still very much alive. After the Atlantic City loss, most of the group disappeared. JP didn't. He stayed in Cambridge, quietly refining the math, replaying every mistake, and searching for a way to try again. But belief alone wasn't enough. If the system was ever going to be tested properly, he needed two things he no longer had: a team and money. To rebuild, JP took an unconventional step. He created his own Blackjack course at MIT, advertising it around campus in the hope of attracting students who were serious enough to commit. The posters promised strategy, mathematics, and discipline, not easy money. What JP didn't expect was to attract the attention of someone outside MIT entirely. A professional poker player named Dave approached him with an offer. Dave was willing to put up $5,000 of his own money to give JP's system one more real-world test. It was a small bankroll by casino standards, but it was enough. In December of 1979, JP and a newly assembled group of MIT students made their way back to Atlantic City. This time, the circumstances were different. Just weeks earlier, the New Jersey Casino Commission had passed a rule making it illegal for Atlantic City casinos to ban players simply for counting cards. If JP's group started winning, the casinos couldn't legally stop them from coming back. For the first time, the math had legal protection. And this trip felt different. The players were more cautious. The betting was tighter. The system was followed more closely. The wild losses of the first trip didn't repeat themselves. When they returned to Cambridge, they hadn't struck gold, but they had something just as important. They had momentum. Over the next few months, as JP continued teaching his class, the group made repeated trips back to Atlantic City. Slowly, steadily, the $5,000 stake grew into $20,000. It wasn't life-changing money, but it was proof. The system worked, at least enough to win. Still, the operation was far from polished. There was no formal structure, no unified strategy. It was less a team and more a loose collection of players sharing ideas and splitting winnings. They had an edge. What they didn't yet have was a machine, and that was about to change. Up to this point, JP's operation was surviving on math and momentum. What it lacked was structure. That changed when JP crossed paths with a man named Bill Kaplan. Bill wasn't an MIT student, but he spoke the same language. After reading a book on card counting, he had taken a gap year from Harvard Business School and headed straight to Las Vegas with $2,000 of his own money and a carefully built mathematical model. 9 months later, he came back with $40,000. Harvard didn't see it as an academic exercise. They saw it as gambling, and they revoked his acceptance. Bill fought back, arguing that what he had done wasn't reckless at all. He explained that Blackjack, when analyzed down to its fundamentals, carried no meaningful risk if played correctly. It was no different than any other business built on probability and discipline. Whether through logic or persuasion, Bill won. Harvard reinstated him, and he graduated with his business degree, all while quietly continuing to refine his blackjack strategies. One evening in a Chinese restaurant in Cambridge, JP overheard Bill talking about his time in Las Vegas. The conversation that followed made one thing immediately clear. They were working on the same problem, from opposite sides. JP understood algorithms, simulations, and statistical modeling. Bill understood capital, incentives, and people. Bill was already managing a successful card-counting team of his own. When JP invited Bill to observe one of the MIT group's Atlantic City trips, the weaknesses became obvious. Players debated strategies at the table. Everyone followed their own system. There was no hierarchy, no consistency, no enforcement. To Bill, it was chaos, but chaos with potential. He agreed to help manage the group under one condition. Everything had to change. No more individual theories. No more improvisation. One system. One strategy. Everyone trained to execute it perfectly. What had once been a relaxed side project would now be run like a business. Some players pushed back. The new rules felt rigid. The fun was gone. But they stayed. And with that decision, JP's loose experiment became something else entirely. The MIT Blackjack team had officially been formed. The transformation was immediate. On August 1, 1980, the newly structured MIT Blackjack team officially began operations. There were 10 players and a bankroll of $89,000, pooled together from both team members and outside investors. Every dollar was tracked. Every session logged. Every decision tied back to the model. For the first time, the system wasn't just theoretical. It was operational. Within 3 months, the team had doubled the investment. Their results matched the projections almost exactly, earning roughly $162 an hour, just shy of the $170 per hour their simulations predicted. This wasn't luck. Under the terms of the investment agreement, profits were split between players and investors. Players were paid based on the number of hours they played and their computer-simulated win rates. Most of them were undergraduates, quietly earning over $80 an hour at blackjack tables while attending classes during the week. The investors did even better. Adjusted annually, returns exceeded 250%, numbers that outperformed almost any traditional investment at the time. Word spread quickly inside the group. Within 4 years, the operation had expanded to 35 players and a total capitalization of $350,000. The model scaled exactly as intended. But the casinos weren't blind. As the wins piled up, so did the attention. Pit bosses began to recognize faces. Security staff took notes. Patterns were flagged. Bill Kaplan, now the most visible figure associated with the team, started feeling it firsthand. He was followed from casino to casino, watched more closely than ever before. And during one particularly tense encounter, a pit boss approached him after a strong run and made the message unmistakably clear. He commented on Bill's nice hands. Not the cards. The hands. The implication wasn't subtle. Bill understood the warning for what it was. Casinos at the time weren't public companies. Oversight was looser. And pushing his luck any further wasn't worth the risk. He walked away. Bill Kaplan retired from active play, shifting his focus to real estate investing. But his departure didn't signal the end of the MIT Blackjack team. It marked a transition. The machine was already built. Now it would have to run without him at the table. Bill Kaplan stepping away from active play could have ended everything. Instead, it forced the team to evolve. Leadership passed to J.P. Masser, alongside veteran members John Chong and Bill Rubin. Over the next several years, the operation continued quietly. Between 1979 and 1989, more than 70 players cycled through the MIT Blackjack team. At times, returns reached 300%, dwarfing traditional investments of the era. Still, despite the success, the team had never fully reached its potential. Then, in February of 1992, the landscape changed. A brand new casino opened just across the Connecticut border, Foxwoods. It was the first legal casino in the state. And for the MIT team, it came with an almost unbelievable advantage. Foxwoods was only a 2-hour drive from campus. Until then, blackjack runs meant 7-hour drives to Atlantic City or cross-country flights to Las Vegas. Now, profitable casino access was close enough for weekend trips, even short overnight runs. It was a perfect storm. Recognizing the opportunity, J.P. Masser and John Chong reached back out to Bill Kaplan. Though no longer playing, Bill agreed to return, this time as an architect. In April of 1992, they formed a new entity, Strategic Investments. Bill structured it as a limited partnership, modeled after real estate development deals he knew well. The terms were simple and ambitious: 40 shares, priced at $25,000 each, creating a $1 million bankroll. Investors who had seen the team's earlier success lined up quickly. But there was a problem. The money was ready. The system was ready. The players were not. Years of intense blackjack had taken its toll. Burnout had hollowed out the roster. Many veterans had moved on, starting careers, families, or simply wanting a normal life. To capitalize on Foxwoods, the team would need a new generation. And they would need them fast. To rebuild at scale, the team turned back to MIT itself. Flyers went up across campus advertising the Blackjack team as the perfect summer job. Unlike earlier versions of the operation, new recruits were not required to invest any of their own money. For students, it was a rare opportunity. High pay, no financial risk, and the backing of a proven system. But getting in was anything but easy. Every interested applicant had to earn their place. Training was relentless. Hours a day, for months at a time. The first step was mastering basic blackjack strategy, drawn directly from Edward Thorp's Beat the Dealer. Players memorized the strategy chart, a precise map of what decision to make based on every possible dealer card. This wasn't intuition. It was obedience to the math. Next came card counting, specifically the high-low method. Players learned to mentally track every card that had been played, assigning values, adjusting counts, and betting only when the remaining deck favored the player. Low cards meant small bets. High cards meant aggression. But none of that mattered if it couldn't be executed under pressure. The hardest part wasn't learning the math. It was learning to operate as a team. Each player was assigned a specific role. The spotter quietly counted cards while betting the minimum. The controller stepped in to confirm the count. And when the moment was right, the big player was called in, signaling, sitting down, and immediately placing massive bets. Everything depended on coordination. Signals were subtle, adjusting a tie, fixing hair, resting a chin on a hand. Nothing obvious. Nothing repeatable to an outsider. To test readiness, recruits faced a final exam known as the checkout. MIT classrooms were transformed into simulated casinos. Loud music blasted. Fake patrons acted drunk and disruptive. Dealers rushed hands. Distractions piled on. Players had to keep perfect counts while executing their roles flawlessly. Only those who passed were allowed to play with real money. One of them was Mike Aonti, a 22-year-old student who had perfected the system in practice. When he was handed $40,000 in cash to play as a big player, the reality of the operation hit hard. In his first 10 minutes at the table, he lost $10,000. Blackjack, even with an edge, was volatile. But Mike trusted the system. He stayed disciplined, waited for favorable counts, and kept betting when the math said to. By the end of the weekend, he returned to campus with a net profit of $25,000. The process worked. Now, the team needed a proving ground. That place would be Foxwoods Casino, the final step in turning recruits into full members of the MIT Blackjack team. Foxwoods wasn't just close. It was unprepared. When the casino opened in 1992, its priority was scale, not security. Tables ran non-stop. Dealers were inexperienced. Surveillance teams were understaffed and still learning how to spot coordinated play. For skilled teams, it was an open door. The MIT Blackjack team walked straight through it. Players rotated in short shifts, often driving up after classes and returning before morning lectures. Big players arrived, placed massive bets for brief windows, then vanished. Spotters blended in with tourists. Controllers verified counts. No one stayed long enough to draw attention. From the casino's perspective, nothing looked unusual. Foxwoods was packed. Money was flowing. Blackjack tables were full. A few players winning big didn't stand out, not yet. But the numbers told a different story. Week after week, the team pulled consistent profits. The $1 million bankroll grew rapidly. Investors saw returns they had been promised, and then some. Confidence inside the operation surged. And that confidence created a dangerous illusion. Foxwoods felt safe. Too safe. The team began to treat it as a home casino, a place they could revisit again and again without consequence. Players became familiar faces. Dealers started recognizing patterns. Surveillance slowly began connecting dots. Not all at once. Quietly. Unnoticed by the people who mattered most. Inside the team, Foxwoods was seen as validation, proof that the system could scale without friction. The training factory had worked. The money was flowing. The risk felt theoretical. But casinos don't lose forever. And Foxwoods was learning. Casinos don't hunt individual wins. They hunt patterns. At Foxwoods, those patterns were beginning to surface. Surveillance teams started noticing the same quiet players returning again and again, always betting small, always leaving when the cards turned cold. They noticed other players who appeared briefly, placed unusually large bets, then disappeared just as suddenly. Individually, none of it proved anything. Together, it formed a shape. Dealers were quietly instructed to slow games. Pits began rotating staff. Blackjack rules subtly shifted, fewer favorable decks, tighter conditions. Players felt it before anyone said it out loud. The casino was adjusting. Inside the MIT team, pressure increased. Profits were still coming in, but margins were tightening. Big players had shorter windows. Spotters were forced to stay longer to create cover. Small mistakes suddenly mattered more. And mistakes started to happen. A mistimed signal. A count confirmed too late. A big player sitting down one hand too early or leaving one hand too late. Nothing catastrophic, just enough friction to raise suspicion. Then came the first direct confrontations. Players were asked for ID. Questioned casually. Sometimes escorted to back rooms. Sometimes simply told, politely, that blackjack play was no longer welcome. Back-offs became more frequent. Each one was logged. Each one reduced flexibility. The system could survive a few exclusions. It couldn't survive them at scale. Internally, stress mounted. Newer recruits lacked the instinct of veterans. Veterans felt the strain of constant travel and constant pressure. The machine that had been built for efficiency was now running hot. Foxwoods was no longer blind. It was watching. And once a casino starts watching, the clock is already ticking. Once Foxwoods understood what it was facing, the response became systematic. Surveillance databases were expanded. Player information was shared internally. Faces, betting styles, table movements, all of it was logged. What had once been isolated back-offs turned into coordinated exclusions. The casino wasn't trying to catch the team cheating. It didn't need to. Card counting was legal. Team play was legal. Foxwoods simply exercised the one power that mattered most, the right to refuse service. Blackjack tables quietly changed. Rules were adjusted to reduce player advantage. Dealers were trained to recognize bet spreads and signaling behaviors. Pit bosses watched for players who arrived together but pretended not to know each other. For the MIT team, every trip became harder. Spotters were burned faster. Big players were flagged earlier. Controllers found fewer clean opportunities to move money efficiently. The once smooth rotation of rolls began to jam. And the math felt different now. The edge still existed on paper, but real-world friction was eating it alive. Each restriction shaved off a fraction of profitability. Each exclusion increased travel costs and reduced table time. The operation adapted where it could, changing casinos, changing faces, changing routines. But Foxwoods had been the engine. Without it, the model weakened. The team wasn't collapsing yet. But for the first time since strategic investments launched, the direction had changed. They were no longer expanding. They were defending. As Foxwoods tightened its grip, the attention didn't stop at the casino floor. The scale of the operation, the money moving, the consistency of returns, the number of players cycling through, began attracting interest from outside the pits. Investors wanted updates. Some wanted more transparency. Others wanted reassurance that the growing number of back-offs wouldn't threaten their capital. Questions that had once been casual became sharper, more frequent, and harder to answer. Internally, leadership felt the squeeze. J.P. Masser and Bill Kaplan now had two fronts to manage, casinos pushing back on one side, investors watching closely on the other. Every decision carried weight. Every trip risked exposure. Every loss, even temporary, required explanation. The limited partnership structure that had enabled growth now imposed discipline. Reporting mattered. Accountability mattered. And accountability reduced flexibility. At the same time, the team faced an unavoidable truth. Word was spreading. Casinos talked. Surveillance techniques improved. The era of amateur oversight was ending. What had once been a blind spot was becoming an industry lesson. The team could still win. But it could no longer operate quietly. The invisible hand that had fueled their rise, anonymity, distance, ignorance, was being replaced by visibility. And visibility was dangerous. By the mid-1990s, the math still worked. But the conditions no longer did. Each trip now required more effort for less return. Players had to rotate through distant casinos. Travel costs rose. Hotel stays lengthened. Table time shrank. What had once been efficient weekend runs turned into exhausting logistical exercises. The team was spending more to earn less. Back-offs accelerated. Some players were barred before they could even sit down. Others were watched so closely that meaningful play became impossible. A few were identified the moment they walked onto the casino floor. The margin for error vanished. Internally, tension increased. New recruits struggled to stay profitable under constant scrutiny. Veterans felt the grind, not just the travel, but the pressure of knowing every session might be their last. Risk, once theoretical, became personal. Leadership faced an uncomfortable reality. Protecting the bankroll now meant limiting exposure. Fewer players, fewer trips, fewer opportunities. But limiting exposure also meant limiting profit. The engine that had fueled growth was now consuming itself. The team hadn't lost its edge. It had lost its environment. And without that environment, continuing wasn't just difficult. It was dangerous. By the time the team recognized how narrow the margins had become, the options were limited. There were still a few casinos where surveillance lagged behind. A few dealers still unfamiliar with team play. A few brief windows where the old system could operate without immediate resistance. The team tried to use them. Trips became shorter and more targeted. Big players flew in, played aggressively for hours, sometimes minutes, and left. Spotters rotated constantly, knowing their usefulness would expire quickly. Every session felt urgent. Every win felt temporary. But urgency cut both ways. Under pressure, discipline slipped. Counts were rushed. Signals were misread. Big bets drew attention faster than before. Even profitable sessions increased long-term risk by accelerating recognition. The system was no longer compounding. It was extracting. Leadership understood what that meant. This wasn't sustainable play. It was endgame strategy. A controlled drawdown of opportunity before the doors closed completely. The team could still win money. But every win shortened the future. The last windows were open. And they were closing fast. The end didn't arrive with a single dramatic loss. It arrived with exhaustion. By the late 1990s, the conditions that had made the MIT Blackjack team possible no longer existed. Casinos had adapted. Surveillance had professionalized. Player databases had matured. The blind spots were gone. Backoffs were no longer occasional. They were expected. Every trip carried a high probability of exclusion. Every new recruit had a shorter lifespan. The cost of training, travel, and coordination outweighed the remaining advantage. At some point, continuing stopped making sense. Strategic investments wound down quietly. The bankroll was preserved. Investors were paid out. There was no public announcement. No collapse on the casino floor. Just a decision. The system that had once beaten casinos at their own game had reached its natural limit. Not because the math failed, but because the world around it changed. The MIT Blackjack team didn't lose. It was outgrown. What happened to the MIT Blackjack team wasn't unique. It followed a pattern casinos had seen before and would see again. Any edge, once discovered, attracts attention. Attention leads to analysis. Analysis leads to adaptation. And adaptation erases the advantage that made the system profitable in the first place. The team didn't fail because of greed. It didn't fail because of carelessness. And it didn't fail because the math was wrong. It failed because success scales visibility. The very efficiency that made the operation powerful also made it easier to study, predict, and neutralize. Casinos learned faster. Surveillance improved. Information spread across properties. The invisible hand that had quietly guided money from tables to bankrolls eventually pushed back. Not with force. With adjustment. This is how systems collapse when they become too effective. They teach the opposition how to respond. When the MIT Blackjack team ended, it didn't leave behind lawsuits or criminal cases. It left behind proof. Proof that casinos could be beaten, temporarily, by discipline, structure, and math. Proof that team-based advantage play could outperform markets that seemed unbeatable. And proof that even legal strategies have a lifespan. Many former players carried those lessons forward. Some moved into finance. Others into technology, consulting, or entrepreneurship. The skills they learned, risk management, probabilistic thinking, emotional control under pressure, transferred cleanly. Casinos learned too. Surveillance systems improved. Training evolved. Foxwoods and others became case studies in how not to underestimate organized play. The game didn't end. It adapted. And that raises the final question, not about blackjack, but about systems. If a legal edge can disappear simply because it works too well, how many other perfect systems are quietly counting down? Because somewhere right now, another advantage exists. And somewhere else, someone is already learning how to erase it.